I'd like to welcome to this event in the fall semester 2021 virtual series assessing China's Belt and Road Initiative, hosted by the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. The Pardee School's mission is to promote and communicate interdisciplinary research on globally important long-term issues that affect the human condition. I'm Grant Rode of the Center for the Study of Asia, here to introduce our topic and our speakers today. Our topic is Chinese and French social capital networks in North Africa. Remarks by our speaker, Professor Lina Benabdallah, will be followed by discussant remarks by Professor Michael Voldemariam. Dr. Benabdallah is the author of Shaping the Future of Power, Knowledge Production, and Network Building in China-Africa Relations, work that provides the contextual basis for her focus today on capital networks in North Africa. She is Assistant Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Wake Forest University, holds degrees from both Algerian and American universities, and is a contributor of articles on Africa to the Washington Post. Dr. Voldemariam is Associate Professor of International Relations at Boston University and is the Political Science Director of the African Studies Center at Boston University, specializing in African security studies. Following the presentation and discussant remarks, we will open the session to a question and answer period for the remainder of our 60 minutes. To ask a question, hit the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Please type in your name and affiliation and then your question. It will be easier for me as moderator to keep track of the questions if you ask your questions in the Q&A tab rather than in the chat tab. Drs. Benabdallah and Voldemariam, welcome. Thank you for joining us to share your thoughts about Chinese and French influence in North Africa. I'm pleased to turn the mic over to you, Professor Benabdallah.
Thank you so much, Professor Rode. Thank you, Professor Voldemariam, for inviting me and for organizing this series. I would like to share my screen now for the presentation. I want to start by giving a brief overview of what I will do here in the talk in the next 25 to 30 minutes. I'll give a brief overview of human capital investments in China, Africa, especially focusing on the Belt and Road cooperation. And then I'll talk a bit about, I'll do a contrast between human capital investments in the historical context in the past and now. And then I'll give a brief timeline and speak about some of the drivers and trends in these human capital investments. My research has focused mostly on looking at China-Africa relations a little bit away from investments in natural resource extractions and investments in infrastructure projects to looking at the people-to-people kind of connections and looking at social capital, investing in social capital. And so I thought I would start by flagging the connection between this and the Belt and Road Initiative. And I know that the series has been inviting experts and speakers to talk about the Belt and Road Initiative from different perspectives. And I wanted here to just go back to the initial 5 platforms that were designed or designated as the platforms of Belt and Road Initiative cooperation and when the initiative started. And so of these 5, you will see on the upper left side, the one that talks about cultural exchanges, which is supposed to promote people-to-people bonds and cooperation. So if we wanted to sort of situate, broadly speaking, the angle from which I approach China-Africa, especially through the Belt and Road cooperation, it would be through this platform. So this is what I focus on, looking at this aspect of the Belt and Road Initiative, which oftentimes gets less attention. It gets talked about less because most of the bulk of the attention is typically given to the other types of cooperation, including the financial integration, the connectivity in terms of infrastructure building, in terms of natural resource extraction, in terms of debt, and all of that. So, but I do want to, if there's one thing I would like our viewers to take away from today, is to definitely think about the importance of this people-to-people aspect of it, and my own argument through my research, whether it's through my first book or other project, is that actually we really need to pay attention to the human capital and social capital investment side in China-Africa relations, whether through the Belt and Road Initiative or outside of it, because I think that this is, in my own view, it's as important as the investments that are done in terms of infrastructure and in terms of natural resource extractions. So the people-to-people connection sort of, to me, provides a connective tissue, a very important base from which to build on and to build and to do the other cooperation, the other 4 cooperation areas. So I just wanted to start with flagging this, putting this into context. And related to the Belt and Road Initiative and this sort of people-to-people connections and the cooperations, I wanted to bring up this Alliance of International Science Organization. The organization was launched in November of 2018, and it is basically involved with the Chinese Sciences Academy. And like you see here, this is a screenshot of basically a meeting, a big meeting that the Chinese Science Academy held in April of 2019, discussing the impact or the importance of human capital investments to BRI projects. And as you can see in the headline, the Chinese Sciences Academy had pledged $268 million for BRI projects. So these projects are specifically, as you can see here, the Chinese Sciences Academy has trained nearly 5,000 high-level science and tech talent for countries and regions participating in the BRI, including more than 1,500 people given the master's and doctoral degrees in sciences and science and engineering. And what's kind of important to see from the report, which is these are quotes from the report, is that it says many of these trainees, they return home and they become a new force in building the BRI. So you could see here the connection that the Chinese Sciences Academy is making between human capital investments and the broader interest of the success of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is to say, building capacity in countries that are host to Chinese Belt and Road Initiative projects is very important, and it's viewed as a larger part of how successful the BRI will be. So building capacity in terms of science, in terms of engineering, has been a priority for the Belt and Road Initiative. And you could see here the action plan for the Alliance of International Science Organization has set up awards, scholarships, joint training projects, and so on. And all of these are framed in terms of the success, the broad success of BRI projects, which is to say, if there's going to be a project that is about building a railway, for example, that it's in the best interest of that project to succeed if there is capacity locally in the recipient country to do the maintenance, to do the day-to-day running of the project. And so that is calculated with the broad sense of the Belt and Road Initiative. And I think this is very important. So this may not necessarily be something you may have seen in the news or grabbed your attention in terms of what's going on with the Belt and Road Initiative, but I think this is the kind of important projects that I think should be brought to light to fully understand the Belt and Road Initiative and all the levels and the layers of cooperation that are afforded with the Belt and Road Initiative projects. Now, to take a step back, what I wanted to do is to basically do a bit of historical framing of student exchange programs and these investments in human capital in the context of China-Africa relations. I'm going to go back and just sort of do a little bit of historical kind of context and framing, and then we come back to sort of the bigger picture here. But the point here is that exchange programs, scholarships focusing on bringing African students and trainees to China is not new. This is not something that started with the Belt and Road, and it's not something that started with in the last 10 or 15 years. It is a phenomenon, part of the relationship. It's a part of the China-Africa story that goes back all the way to the 1950s. As you can see, and the screen here is an image of a book titled An African Student in China. It was published in 1963 by Emmanuel John Havey, who's from Ghana, who was invited to go to China with a delegation of Ghanaian students and other African students who were invited to go to China to study in the late 50s, early 60s. And then, of course, as we know, because of the Cultural Revolution, lots of students from African countries and elsewhere had to sort of return home during that time because of the closures of different universities and because of the climate was not necessarily favorable to these exchanges. And then Emmanuel John Havey writes this book in 1963, essentially giving us a sense of basically what's going on what does life look like for an African studying in China. So I thought this was really interesting to flag, because even though the sort of domestic politics of China that he was describing in the book have changed tremendously today from the 1960s to now, there remain to be quite interesting comparisons in terms of the, especially in light of COVID-19 and in light of some of the reactions we saw by African students in China due to that, and sort of to put that into a comparative perspective with time. So it was interesting how obviously, as you can see, the Emmanuel Havey lays out a very strong case for why his experience being in China was not a very favorable one. And so you could see sort of, you know, the 6 causes and broad lines of dissatisfactions that he writes about, including undesirable political indoctrination, language difficulty, poor education standards, inadequate social life. And basically his account of life in China at the time was rather negative, was rather dire. But at the same time, as we know, in terms of China-Africa relations in the early 1960s, and around the same time as his book was published, we have Zhou Enlai tour of Africa and sort of that solidarity rhetoric and the very warm kind of win-win relationship that was typical of the China-Africa relationship at the time. So it's kind of interesting to see the contrast of what was happening on the ground in terms of an African student based in China and what was happening more or less at the government sort of top level between governments, and sort of portraying the relationship at sort of those 2 different levels. But going forward in terms of the timeline, so the first, we can basically look at it from 4 and maybe 5, even if we add the BRI, but I would say 4 milestones in terms of understanding the evolving sort of scholarship programs and human capital investments in the China-Africa relationship. You have in the 1950s and 60s, these were the very first cohorts. Obviously, John Havey is one of them, and I flag here in 1956. There were 4 Egyptian students who were the very first to go to China to study in China under these cooperation projects. So this goes back all the way to the 1950s as African countries gained their independence, and some of these exchange programs were actually established before independence, like lots of these projects with Algeria, for example. They were between the PRC and the provisional government of Algeria. This was even before independence in 1962. By 1966, there were 164 students from 14 African countries. You will see the numbers are going to look very different today, obviously. But as I mentioned, because of a cultural revolution, that number even got smaller by the late 1960s. But then there is the Tazara Railway, which was finished by 1976. This was a project of building a railway between Tanzania and Zambia. And and of course here the connection is that there were lots of opportunities and need to basically train engineers from these two countries, from Zambia and Tanzania, in China, in order to do the maintenance of the railway. So once it was finished, the Tazara Railway remains until today China's biggest and most basically expensive in terms of cost construction project in Africa. So when you account for inflation, when you account for the value of the project, it remains the biggest infrastructure project in the continent. But obviously, because it was built by Chinese companies, there was a need to train engineers in Chinese institutions so that they can manage the maintenance and the day-to-day operations of the railway. So due to that, there were 355 students who were invited to join engineering programs starting from the Tazara project. So the numbers increase a tiny bit. And then the fourth milestone, I would say, is starting the year 2000, when we have the Forum of China-Africa Cooperation. And then you see a more institutionalized cooperation in terms of human capital investments. And I will talk a little bit more about this, but I want to keep contextualizing what does it look like starting the year 2000. You could see here international students at Chinese institutes and institutions of higher education. You see basically numbers of African students in the column there between the year 2003, where you had about 1,793 students, and you fast forward to the year 2018, and the numbers there's a staggering contrast, right? So you have 81,562 students. So essentially the trend is going up, and it's increasing very rapidly in terms of inviting African students to get trainings and to get degrees in Chinese institutions. Obviously, when we do a quick comparison here, there has been a few articles and statistics about starting 2015 and 16. Chinese universities are now the largest destination, or the fastest growing and the largest destination, the top destination for African students. So African students are going, so more African students are going to Chinese universities than they're going anywhere else abroad. And so you can see through this brief capture here the trend for African students going to Chinese universities versus, then you have Europe, and then you have Asia, just to give you a sense of where things stand from a multilateral perspective. And then zooming in into specific countries, and you see the trends here. This was an infographic put by Mail and Guardian about African students and where they prefer to study. And this is a comparison between 2011 and 2017 to give you a small idea, or a quick idea, of where things stand. And you see the trend for China, which is in red here, is an upward trend. Whereas for France, since we're comparing today China to France in a kind of a broad sense, then you see the trend I zoomed into the year 2013 and 14 in this image here, just to show you that there was quite a big dip actually in the number of scholarships and number of students, African students studying in France. But overall, even if it stabilized starting 2017, you see that there are more African students studying in China than there are in France, despite maybe the relationship and the early numbers that I was sharing with you, with 166 African students in the 60s. This was matched by hundreds of thousands of African students in France during the same time in the 60s. But then we see the trends go in completely opposite directions now, where you have a lot more African students studying in Chinese universities. This quick infographic just shows you, puts things into perspective, sort of where things are standing in China and how they compare to the US the UK, and France. And then we can come back to this later in the Q&A, but I just wanted to put a quick sort of visual of where things stand. In terms of cultural institutes and in terms of where they are in Africa, you will notice that France here has more cultural institutes open, the Alliance Française, compared to Confucius Institutes and Confucius classrooms. Then you definitely have a lot more cultural institutes, French cultural institutes than Chinese cultural institutes, both in Africa and also reflected worldwide. But I will say that if actually we look at where the Confucius and cultural institutes are distributed across the African continent, we will see that the Chinese Confucius institutes are more equally distributed across the continent. So there are now 45 African countries that have a Confucius Institute. And in terms of French cultural institutes, these tend to be focusing mostly in Francophone African countries. So the distribution is not equal across the continent the same way that Confucius institutes are. I wanted to spend some time briefly kind of contextualizing the drivers here. And I wanted to say, I wanted to put this two quotes, one from 1983 and one from 2020, just to give you a quick idea of how these human capital investments are viewed from Chinese government officials. And so, again, this is a quote from 1983, and it says, attention should be paid to human resource training, apologies about that, which costs not much, but means a lot. So it's a relatively low cost investment, but it can have big returns of that investment. And I highlighted this underlined part. It says people who received our training will be more naturally kind to China. So there's a soft power element that goes into these investments in human capital. But our goal is not to develop pro-China, mainly train talents for them, which is really indispensable for them. So basically talking about third world countries, developing countries that cannot go well without talents. We have to use energy for training, not only provide material aid, but also human resource training. So this is another important element here to say that natural resources and infrastructure projects have never been the only aspect of China-Africa relations, going all the way back to the 50s, and then here to the 80s. We see that there's an importance paid to human resource and human capital investments. Similar thing, Wang Yi announced just in October 2020, so last year around this time, basically giving a quick sense of China-Africa relations. But what was kind of notable about it is that he dedicated some space to discussing human capital investments. And so essentially, as you can see from the quote, he is highlighting the 120,000 government scholarships to African countries, the Confucius Institutes, the Confucius classrooms, the doctors and nurses that were trained, and so on. And this is now a feature, human capital investments is now a feature, a strong feature of China-Africa relations through FOCAC. FOCAC is the Forum of China-Africa Cooperation. The last forum took place in 2018 in Beijing. The next one is taking place next month in Dakar, in Senegal. But quick view from 2018, FOCAC, the forum announced sort of basically these numbers, 50,000 government scholarships, training opportunities, seminars, Luban workshops. Luban workshops are vocational training workshops. So they are small institutes that focus on Chinese traditional medicine, or they focus on some part of maintenance of infrastructure projects. So they target skills, particular vocational skills. And you could see here there is a sort of an increasing trend of paying attention to human capital investments through FOCAC. Now, in terms of why, of course, we saw from the quote, it's relatively it's relatively low cost, but highly effective, because bringing young Africans and African elites, government officials, reporters, ministers, bureaucrats, civil servants to China for trainings has the opportunity to create a platform for building relationships, building networks, experiencing China firsthand, instead of being exposed to what French media say about China, Africa. Then you're inviting reporters from African countries to China so that they can have their own experiences of China, they can form their own opinions of China, instead of copying or just inheriting the narratives that are kind of framed by dominant media conglomerates in the continent. And so there's a big aspect here of that human people-to-people connection, the bonding aspect that's really important. There's also the aspect of really sharing China's development model, sharing China's success, showing these delegations around, taking them through different cities in order to sort of show them sort of how far has China come in the last several decades, and how that sort of serves as sort of creating and boosting aspirations to basically achieve similar levels of development. And so these are things that I talk about in my book, and I talk about sort of not only the aspect of scholarship there, but really I focus on summit diplomacy as well, where some of these people-to-people connections and investments in human capital and investments in social capital come in the form of summits that are not only and programs that are not only targeting students. This isn't just student scholarships. It's not just for reporters and journalists, but it actually spans, cuts across all types of relations in China, Africa. So there are summits and training and exchange opportunities that are planned for security and defense area. So this would be an example of the security forum that took place in 2019, where high-ranking defense attaches from over 50 African countries were invited to go to China to spend 2 weeks to basically get to know their Chinese counterparts, to talk about security, to talk about common interests and aspirations, but also to do lots of touring of Chinese facilities and Chinese cities, and just really get to know and be really form working relationships with Chinese counterparts. There are also opportunities for trainings in terms of peacekeepers. Lots of African peacekeepers train in China. And of course, there are also police training academies in China that host delegations from African countries for trainings. Human capital investments also have expand to think tanks, as you see here, the China-Africa Think Tank Forum, which means they also are interested in bringing universities and think tanks and creating opportunities for joint programs that write about China, Africa, that produce briefs and documents about China, Africa, that kind of form and inform the public on that. And of course, I talked a bit about the media as well, which is another big area of social and human capital investments in China-Africa relations, which I'll end with this. I talk a bit about it as well in my book, but there's a big interest in actually shaping the narrative about what reporters in African media outlets say about China-Africa relations. And sort of the best way to do this is to engage in these programs that invite African reporters to go to China, whether they spend sort of a quick 3 to 4 week training or they stay for degree granting programs. The idea is the same. The idea is that they will get to be exposed to China firsthand, and they will be taken on these curated tours and all of that in order to get them to have their own views of China-Africa relations instead of being influenced by Western and European media and the way that they report on China-Africa. So I will end here and hand it over to Professor Woldemariam, and then I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Benabdallah. This has been a very broad sweep, but looking at a number of factors that you've gone into more detail in your book about the science exchange, as well as security and media journalist exchanges and so forth, and joint education programs. So although you focus more on the earlier science exchanges, there is much richer data on these other subjects as well. So I'm going to ask Professor Woldemariam to make some comments on these remarks. Please.
Great, thanks, Professor Rode, and thanks, Professor Abdallah. I think there's a few questions in the chat on the really fascinating data on the rise or the increase in the African student population in China. I think that's really quite, maybe we can unpack that a little bit later. It's really interesting. So look, I am not a China and Africa scholar. So my starting point for this conversation is sort of twofold. First, I'm a scholar of East Africa and the Horn, specifically on the kind of security side. So my vantage point on the themes I think we're talking about today is really from that particular regional context. And second, I had an opportunity to reflect on some of Professor Benabdallah's work yesterday. So I had read a chapter from her recent book, which was really fantastic. I think I read chapter 4 on military to military contacts and social network building, social capital building. And actually, I plan on assigning that chapter in my class next semester on African politics, because it was really quite powerful. And one of the reasons that I find the professor's research agenda on social capital networks of external powers so powerful is that, at least in the context of East Africa and the Horn, the issue is somewhat unexplored. This is it's a very crowded geopolitical playing field with middle and major powers jockeying for influence. But the discussion, in my view, has really focused on the material aspects of this competition overwhelmingly. And that's true not only in intellectual circles, but in policymaking circles as well. So this whole conversation that the professor has pushed forward, I really appreciate and find compelling. So let me just throw out a couple of things that I'm curious about when it comes to Chinese, and part of the conversation, or the title of the panel is also includes French social capital networks as well. And maybe there are people in the audience who may want to offer something on that. But I just want to throw out a few things from my vantage point, looking at the Horn of Africa about these particular items. And they, of course, have broader relevance beyond the Horn. So the first is really, about the resilience of these networks, particularly, on the Chinese side. Chinese social capital networks in the Horn of Africa run very deep, of course. I think many of us know that. And Ethiopia, in particular, is quite fundamental to that whole effort from the Chinese perspective for a lot of different reasons we could discuss. Of course, there's been writing on the party-to-party links between the Chinese Communist Party and the EPRDF, some really fascinating work in that regard. Some interesting networks between line ministries, important commercial networks, military to military contacts that were probably better than what the United States had with Ethiopia, even though the two were, allies, presumably in the war on terror. We'll talk about that at some length. But I'd say by the end of 2017, sort of that sort of warm embrace was running into some trouble. I remember hearing at the end of 2017 about sort of Ethiopian attempts to restructure their Chinese debt, which led to some very difficult conversations with Beijing. And there's some other issues as well. And then, of course, in 2018, this gets to the resilience point, we get effective kind of regime change in Ethiopia. A new leader that was understood, at least at the time. Things have changed a lot now because of the Ethiopian conflict, as being pro-Western. He's going to democratize the country, liberalize the economy, he was presumably put a lot of distance between the Ethiopian state and their Chinese interlocutors. That was the narrative, at least at the time. I've done a bit of research on this. And so, the question this raises for me is, what these kinds of major macro political ruptures on the African side mean for Chinese investments in these social capital networks and their durability. I'm really quite curious about that. And I have the same question about Sudan as well, which of course in 2019, China's been embedded in the Sudanese political economy for some time. Then you get, effectively regime change, revolution 2019. And the narrative there was, this was a government that would now, in a new order that would look to the West. So what did I'm curious again, what that meant for the resilience of these networks. So, my questions aren't specific to these countries, but that broader issue. The second point of curiosity is on the French. That may be, I think we have some people in the audience that may be able to take this up, or Professor Benabdallah. I've been quite curious looking at the Horn about their ability to really build social capital networks outside of traditional areas of influence on the continent, and how successful that project has been. And it seems to me that in the Horn, France is really trying to do this more and more and move beyond Djibouti in particular, right? Of course, France had been in Djibouti as a colonial power until 1977. Links run deep there. So in Ethiopia, when there was a leadership transition, France really seemed to try and seize that opportunity. And so there was an expansion of defense cooperation, at least on paper, including on naval issues, which is fascinating because Ethiopia actually doesn't have a coast. And those arrangements, I think, are now paused because of the conflict in Ethiopia. But I think France clearly does hope to preserve those ties and expand them, you see that given how sort of carefully they're walking around the Tigray issue in particular, some of their diplomacy on that within the EU. But again, I just wonder whether that move beyond non-traditional partners for France, how it's going, what the constraints are, how it'll work. Third, I'm quite interested, in how these different social capital networks intersect, interact, overlap, reinforce one another. We think about, for instance, the networks that the United States is trying to establish in those of China as being diametrically opposed. I think they are, right? But then we have all of these other players, right? China, France, in the Horn, at least, we've got the Gulf countries building all sorts of networks, Turkey, and then, there's a question of Russia as well. And so I wonder how complementary these networks are. Do they touch one another? I'm just sort of curious about the interplay between them. And then, fourth would be, I'm also interested in how China, specifically on the question of China, how China prioritizes its social capital investments. It's really quite interesting, particularly on the security side, having read Professor Benabdallah, your chapter, I think it was chapter 4 again. Of course, China can't do everything. It can't invest everywhere. So how does it think about prioritizing? With respect to the United States, sometimes the constraints are what makes you prioritize, right? So for the United States, there's Leahy vetting, there's all of these rules on foreign assistance and how it can be deployed. I remember on Sudan, for instance, once there was, the US military was quite keen on engaging the Sudanese military after the revolution in 2019, but had to go very slowly because of congressional pressure and just a lot of questions about whether legally you could engage them given all kinds of foreign assistance rules and regulations. So I'm just curious how China goes about prioritizing giving limited means. And then another issue, I'll wrap up in a moment, is the question of models, and what models China may look to in building these social capital networks. And I'm really quite taken by, the way you've historicized these social capital networks, right? And so they go back deep. Of course, when it comes to party-to-party relations, with SWAPO in Namibia, or even the EPRDF. These are very old relations, party-to-party relations. But I recall reading in chapter 4 of your book on the security side, the way in which Chinese private military companies were learning from Western ones, the Europeans, the Americans, in terms of their engagement in Africa. Perhaps the Russians as well with Wagner. I don't know, but I'm curious about how these models are emerging and how they're learning from other places. And then the final question is really the obvious question about, effectiveness and success. How China thinks about the effectiveness of this project, cultivating these networks, and how outside observers should think about it. Among observers of US-Africa relations, a lot of people do wonder about, how effective this effort in social capital building has been, right? And the narrative around some programs like YALI, the Young African Leaders Initiative, is a very positive one, right? But when you get to IMIT training, international military education and training, a lot of people say it's not really that effective. I don't have the expertise to know either way. But the classic case of the colonel that's trained at a U.S. institution in Kansas and then launches a coup. I think that happened in Mali or Guinea, right? So yeah, I'm just curious how China thinks about effectiveness and what you think, how you think about effectiveness. So I'll just stop there. I think it's a fascinating discussion and hope to learn more.
Okay, well, there's a lot there to unpack, and I would like Professor Benabdallah for you to make some comments, but we have questions in from 4 other people that I'd like to get to who are participating in the seminar. And so I'll ask you to make a response, and then we'll go to those questions. That's
Yeah, thank you so much. I agree. These are excellent points, and we can spend a lot of time unpacking each one of them because they're amazing, and also they are very important questions to ask in the China-Africa relationship. So I'll try to tackle a few of them and see how they, how we're doing on time and as we go. But I was particularly interested in the question of, I mean, they're all really amazing questions, but the part about the resilience of the network, it's something that I've thought about quite some time myself, because as you said, the example of Ethiopia, where there's, a big regime change. We've seen this also in Zambia, where, at the time of regime transition, you have an outgoing president who takes a specific stand on China, and then an incoming one who takes an opposite stand on China, and we expect the relationship to go in a different direction, and then it doesn't. And so it's really interesting to ask that question of resilience and to to try to understand a little bit where that comes from. I mean, and my argument, obviously, is that there is something to the China-Africa relationship that goes a little bit beyond what we see in terms of, infrastructure projects, and that sort of invisible infrastructure, that social connective tissue that is built during and thanks to these opportunities, I think is key to understanding the resilience. So when it comes to party-to-party trainings, the CCP does not just hold party-to-party trainings with African political parties that are leaning ideologically close to China. In fact, they actually use the party-to-party delegation exchange platform to build as many connections and as many networks with all the parties, all the political parties in the landscape. And that's a very smart investment in the event of a regime transition, in the event of a shock in terms of political system. At least there's a base of some form of relationship built with the other parties, with the other political parties. So that it's actually not at all. And what's fascinating to me about looking at the CCP and how it establishes relationships with all the political parties from across the spectrum in Africa, when you contrast that to what Biden administration has been using recently in terms of its approach to the world, saying, using the word like-minded democracy, like-minded political party, like-minded societies, that's very ideologically isolated and narrow. Whereas the CCP, which typically gets viewed as the ideological sort of actor in the room, is open to creating networks and creating exchange visits and all of these, kind of platforms for cooperation with political parties from across the spectrum. And I think that makes a difference at the end of the day. It provides some basic, a basic level of social connection there from which you can build on. I think that to me is very key. The other really important, or one of the very wonderful questions you posed that I want to spend some time talking about is the question of Djibouti and the question of the Horn of Africa and how basically complementary the networks are. And when we compare this, of course, when it comes to sort of China and France and sort of looking at the relationship from a competitive perspective there, besides North Africa, of course, Djibouti comes to mind as an important sort of place to do a quickly comparison. Of course, Djibouti has now several countries have military presence in Djibouti now, and of course France, the US, but more recently China. What's interesting about visiting Djibouti was at least in my perspective, in the few days that I was in Djibouti and talking to people and looking at the situation on the ground, what you see is, you know that there's a Chinese base, sure, but you see around the city all kinds of investments. There are apartment complexes built by Chinese companies. There's a mall that was built by a Chinese company. There are programs on the ground for training in terms of public health programs. There's of course the port, which employs a lot of local people. The base is not, and the military relation there is not all there is to see. Whereas when you look at France-Djibouti relations, besides colonial history, there's just the base. There's really nothing on the ground in the city that you can see that presents the French relationship to Djibouti in any angle other than military. And so there's no investment in people. There's no investment in the city. On the Chinese side, you have plans to do tourism, to develop hotels, to develop the tourism industry, to explore the Tajura Gulf, and to essentially all kinds of booming investment relationships that are going to improve quality of life, that are going to provide opportunities, not only for students through Confucius Institutes, but for everybody. And whether those are going to materialize or not, I'm just speaking from experience of what I saw on the ground. On the French side, it's either stuck in history, colonial legacy, or it's in the base, and that's about it. And similarly with the US, like Camp Lemonnier is big, it's huge, it's operating, it has basically a lot of activities there, but outside of Camp Lemonnier, there's really no presence. There's nothing that's going on in the city outside of that military perspective. And that is something that's very different about how China is approaching its relationship in Africa and with African countries. So I think just to wrap up quickly and turn it over to questions, I think that's to me that actually shows the difference there, that it's not just about the military. It's the military aspect of it, or the base aspect of it, is just one part of a bigger complex of relationships that China is interested in investing in. But that also gets to your final question, which is sort of the biggest, and to me, it is the biggest kind of ongoing puzzle. How successful are these investments? How are they efficient? How do we know if they're efficient? And as much as I don't know, basically a causal story to how efficient they are, what we know anecdotally, for example, all kinds of anecdotes and stories about how we can establish that these networks are leading to more positive perceptions of China in Africa, but also really when we look at the trend and we see that it's increasing, so the Chinese government is spending more and more money on these investments, then it tells us that something is working, something must be working. Otherwise, there would be restructuring of these, just the same way we don't see these big elephant, kind of white elephant projects that are that were this mega infrastructure projects that used to be a trademark of China Africa relations in the early 2000s, but now they went away because they don't work. But in terms of these human capital investments, they're not going away. They're increasing. The numbers are increasing. And of course, as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, now through the Belt and Road Initiative, we see more and more projects and programs that are dedicating a lot of time and money and resources to these to trainings, to joint programs and trainings and so on. So they are essential to the success of the BRI. If local capacity building does not allow for maintaining a project 5 years from now, it won't work, then it's not good look for the BRI. So it's kind of built in as part of making sure BRI projects work. So in a way, you know, they are working and they are here and they're here to stay. So I'll end here, but I really liked, you know, all the questions you asked, and I would love to spend some time thinking about some and discussing others that if we have the time to come back to some of them. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. We have 4 people who have asked questions that I'd like to get to, perhaps in 2 groups of 2. And the first have to do particularly with exchanges. I would just like to say that the infographic that you put up that showed the very strong position and the changing position of China vis-a-vis France, of the number of students that are going from Africa to those countries is very instructive. But I think also the third and fourth laggers, the US and the UK, are also very interesting questions that we won't have time to address today. But I think that from the American perspective, those statistics are also provocative and require thought. So the first question that I'd like to ask from an anonymous attendee is about the number of students who actually pay full fees. Instead of a lump sum, do people get scholarships? And curious about the difference between the cost of a degree in France versus China. Is this affecting the numbers? So a very interesting logistical question. And from Kigali, Rwanda, Reed Whitlock has been thinking about many of these issues and has a more extensive train of thought in terms of his questioning. He'd like to hear a little bit greater detail about shift in preference toward PRC universities for African higher education students. He suspects that the trend towards PRI institutions is not because these institutions are actually preferred, but because the student visas and the acceptances are more easily obtained. Scholarships are also more available. And then a second aspect of his question is about the existence and usefulness of chambers of commerce as networks, Chinese chambers of commerce, in terms of the people-to-people relationship for relationship building in Africa, that he's only been aware of branches in a few countries. So why don't we start with those networking questions?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think, yeah, the 2 questions are, they touch on similar aspects. I think both attendees for the questions, whether students pay full fee or they are on scholarships, I think it's a mix in terms of just drawing on my own experience doing fieldwork and speaking to fellow Africans and students and reporters doing trainings in China. I've talked to some who were on full scholarships and others who were basically on their government sponsored, on their own government or Chinese government or their own money. So all kinds of different arrangements there. But I think there's definitely a strong argument to be made about the increasing attention and preference of African students to Chinese universities has something to do with the scholarships, of course. That's one of the biggest elements, that the Chinese government has been providing fully paid scholarships to an increasing number of African students, and therefore we definitely will see that these students, they can, you know, be talking to their family members or word of mouth, or they'd be posting about their experiences in China, or then their friends and their neighbors, and people know about this, and then so that increases. Then the numbers grow because of that, because of the experiences they share. But like I said, I also spoke to a few who were actually paying themselves out of pocket to continue their studies in China. So this particular case of a reporter who first went to China on a Chinese government paid training, which was about 3 to 4 weeks. But then, of course, he enjoyed the experience so much, he decided to go back for a PhD degree, and he was paying out of pocket. The question of tuition fees, of course, it's a very important question. And we know, for example, in the UK, the US, other places, tuition fees are extremely prohibitive, and it makes a big difference in terms of where students go when tuition fees are more affordable. But the other question that was asked again is about the visas, and I think that's a very valid point. The US, obviously, as we know, especially through the last administration, has not only reduced the numbers of visas given to Africans in general, but actually also put several African countries on some ban list where they would just not at all receive any visas. And of course, that has a tremendous negative impact on these exchanges, even if, even for students who are planning on paying out of pocket, if you're not able or allowed or qualified to get a visa at all, then of course that, so it's not just that China has been increasing its intake of African students, it's also that European and American universities have decreased their intake, right? It's not just a factor of China providing scholarships and visas. It's actually also, the trend is going both directions as well, where US universities are just admitting fewer and fewer international students for a lot of reasons. So the trends are going both directions is what I want to focus on there.
Any comment on the Chamber of Commerce question?
I didn't quite catch that, but I'll go back and read it and see if I have any comment on that. I'm just trying to be.
Yes. Okay, so I'll let you follow up with that with Reed Whitlock. There's also another question that's come in on Confucius Institutes by somebody who arrived late, and I think I'll let that be a follow-up question as well, because your slides and the recording from this session will be available, and that Madia Thompson would be able to review that later. But let me go on to two remaining questions, and we won't have time for follow-up questions about what we've already commented on. But M. Toombs asked Professor Voldemariam about his mentioning Sudan's turn to the West, given al-Bashir's deposement in 2019 and the traditional government's trend towards democratization. How do you predict that trajectory has changed given this week's military coup that overthrew the CLTG? What do you think that means for Chinese investment? But before that, I'll just ask one closing question from Dan Weissman at Harvard, which is a broader but quite interesting question. On US-China rivalry is well known in Africa and around the world, but is France seeking siding with one superpower or the other in Africa? Or is France attempting to create a third way in Africa, similar to how the PRC originally did during the USSR Cold War? So with those questions, some response, and then we'll wrap up.
Great. Well, Professor Benabdallah, maybe I could just jump in on Sudan, and I'll say something very quickly on France and the third way. I mean, on Sudan, I mean, China's, the political economy of Chinese engagement in Sudan was changing a little bit already before the revolution, because a lot of what China had been doing in Sudan was in the oil sector. And then you had the partition of the Sudans, and a lot of the oil went to South Sudan. So, I mean, China was still engaged, I think, obviously as an investor in North Sudan, but not in the same way. And, you know, with the revolution, yeah, obviously, as I said before, I mean, there was a change in diplomatic posturing from the transitional government towards the United States and the Europeans. They were big stakeholders in the entire transition. They helped broker that deal. But of course, the Chinese ties remained and the Chinese investments remained. Now, going forward, if in fact this coup sticks and we don't see a transition to democracy, I mean, I would anticipate that there'll be more opportunity for China to up its investments and its engagement, because from Sudan's perspective, there's no real alternative. I mean, there had been, the United States had put $700 million on the table as part of the Abraham Accords and the normalization of US-Sudan ties. The Europeans had put a lot of money on the table. The World Bank was coming in with a lot of cash. So that was going to help prop up what is a very fragile, weak Sudanese economy. That's all going to go away if the transitional documents are not adhered to and we don't see a democratic transition in Sudan. And so what other alternative is there for Sudan? There's the Gulf, and then of course, China most likely, right? And so that's sort of how I see it. On France, the third way, my answer to that question is yes and no. China is trying to build a third way and it isn't. I mean, if you look at the Sahel, obviously there are close security cooperation and alignment between the United States and France. Differences, of course. But then at the same time, if you look at sort of the US-Europe partnership in Africa, I would say France, this is just my own view, I haven't looked at it super closely, is that France tries to steer a more independent course from the United States than say the UK or Germany. So looking at the diplomacy, international diplomacy around Ethiopia, for instance, you see France kind of echoing the US position, but not completely. And so I think that's quite interesting. So I see France as kind of, we saw it in Djibouti as well, as the US upped its military engagement in Djibouti in the early 2000s. France was very, from what I understand, quite nervous about that. And so you see this kind of a kind of duality to sort of how France and the United States are engaging in Africa. That's my broad impression.
Yeah, and I would absolutely agree. I think definitely when it comes to, in my view, whether China or whether France is going to side with either one of the kind of the superpowers in the US-China rivalry, I would agree that that as far as I can see it, France considers itself one of the superpowers in Africa, and that it has its own way of doing things. But honestly, what I wanted to also add to this is that from the African perspective, the US is really not, the US just hasn't showed up. On the level of rhetoric, yes, there is a US-China rivalry felt. But in terms of practice, in terms of on-the-ground investments, and in terms of enterprises and companies doing business, there's not a lot of presence of US. There's no rivalry felt on the ground. The rivalry remains located within the discourse, more so than it is on the ground. And because of that, I don't think that there's going to be a huge kind of positioning that France needs to do vis-a-vis whether it's going to side this way or the other. I think it's a fascinating question, but I do agree that France itself sees itself as a superpower in the continent, and it, as we saw last week or 2 weeks ago with the Francophonie summit, with Macron basically just trying to show up and not let sort of only China has a summit and only China has these kind of grand gesture summit diplomacy with Africa. So you see France trying to sort of make its I would say independent way, just as Professor Waldemariam just framed it earlier. So I would agree with that, but I would just question whether the US really is a superpower in Africa. I think that's a big question that I don't necessarily think is on the ground quite true so far.
Okay, so with that large and profound question, we'll start our wrap up. And I'll say in closing, thank you to all of you who joined us for this virtual event. With special thanks to Drs. Benabdallah and Waldemariam for sharing their keen observations today. Our appreciation goes to the BU Center for the Study of Europe and the African Studies Center for co-sponsoring this event, and to Elizabeth Amrian for recording the talk. The recording of this event will be posted on the website of the Party School of Global Studies on the webpage with the series label, Assessing China's Belt and Road Initiative. I'm Grant Rode from the Party School at BU. Glad that you have joined us today for this thought-provoking BRI Fall Semester 2021 discussion. Our session 2 weeks from today features Drs. Lyle Goldstein and Abby Tingstad addressing China, Russia, and the Polar Silk Road. And I'll mention that in the chat that Lyle Goldstein has attended, considered this to be an outstanding session, and congratulations to presenters. And I agree with that. And I think it's been an interesting aspect of this series that many of the presenters have returned to learn about subjects that they're less specialized in, but find the sessions interesting. So much appreciation to those who joined us today. Thank you all very much.